Mrs. Carter, answer the question? Judge Eleanor Whitfield's voice cut through the silence. I tried. My lips parted, but no words came. A crushing weight spread across my chest as though an invisible hand had wrapped itself around my heart and refused to let go. The courtroom blurred. I tightened my grip on the witness stand, willing my legs to stay beneath me. Not now, please, not now. They already think I'm lying. They... Across the room, my husband slowly shook his head. I told you, he said quietly. She always does this when things stop going her way. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. I forced myself to inhale. Pain shot down my left arm. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Carter. The word never became a sentence. My knees buckled. Before I reached the floor, someone vaulted over the courtroom railing. I'm a cardiologist, the man shouted, already checking my pulse. His calm expression disappeared almost instantly. Her pulse is irregular. He looked toward the bailiff. She's hypotensive. Then he raised his voice so loudly that every conversation in the courtroom stopped. Call 911 now. No one laughed anymore. Until 6 months before that morning, I believed my life was wonderfully ordinary. My name is Claire Carter. I'm 54 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a librarian in Fairfax County, Virginia. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. Libraries attract every kind of person: children discovering books for the first time, college students chasing impossible deadlines, retirees looking for quiet afternoons, and people who simply need a warm place where no one asks difficult questions. I liked being part of that. Books taught me that every person carried a story invisible to everyone else. I just never expected my own story to become one. My husband, David Carter, owned a small residential construction company. He had built it from a pickup truck, 2 employees, and an endless supply of determination. I admired that about him. Whenever people complimented our marriage, I usually smiled and said the same thing. We grew up together. It wasn't literally true, but it felt that way. We met in our 20s, learned adulthood together, buried our parents together, celebrated promotions together, and quietly accepted that children were never going to be part of our future. Instead, we built traditions: Friday dinners, Sunday morning walks. Every October, we drove to the Shenandoah Valley just to watch the leaves change color. Small habits become the architecture of a long marriage. You don't notice how much they matter until one disappears. David's business began struggling about 2 years before our divorce. Construction projects slowed. Material costs climbed. Several clients delayed payments for months. At first, he talked openly about everything. I'll figure it out, he would say. And I believed him, because he always had. Then something changed. Instead of talking, he started protecting me from the truth. Or at least that's what he told himself. He stayed later at the office, answered phone calls outside, closed his laptop whenever I entered the room. I noticed. I simply assumed he was embarrassed. Looking back, embarrassment was only part of the story. Around the same time, my mother-in-law, Janet Carter, became a much larger presence in our lives. Janet wasn't cruel. She was convinced she was practical. Her husband had spent nearly 7 years battling lung disease before he passed away. During those years, she became his full-time caregiver, driving him to appointments, organizing medications, and sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed more nights than I could count. That experience changed her. She developed an almost stubborn belief that worrying made people sicker. Whenever someone complained about pain, her instinct wasn't sympathy. It was encouragement. Get up. Keep moving. Don't let your body win. She believed those words had helped her husband survive longer. Whether they had or not, I couldn't say. But they shaped the way she saw illness, including mine. The first warning came while I was shelving books one Tuesday afternoon. The library was unusually quiet. I reached toward the top shelf when a wave of dizziness swept over me so suddenly that I grabbed the book cart to stay upright. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then it was gone. My coworker Emily frowned. You okay? I stood up too fast. She accepted that answer. So did I. A week later, climbing the stairs at home left me unexpectedly breathless. Not exhausted. Breathless. The feeling disappeared after a minute. I didn't mention it. At my annual physical, my doctor suggested a few routine tests after hearing a faint heart murmur that hadn't been there the previous year. Probably nothing serious, she said. But I'd like to be thorough. I appreciated that. David did too, at least at first. Better safe than sorry, he told me while driving home. That night, he even reminded me to schedule the cardiology appointment. I remember smiling. I didn't know you were going to become my personal assistant. He laughed. I married you, it's part of the job. Sometimes I replay that conversation because it reminds me that people rarely become strangers overnight. The distance between us was built one compromise at a time. One secret, one assumption, one missed conversation. Neither of us recognized it while it was happening. 3 weeks later, the cardiologist ordered additional imaging. There are a few things I'd like to rule out, he explained. He didn't sound alarmed. He sounded careful. I appreciated careful. Unfortunately, careful is often mistaken for uncertainty. When I told Janet about the extra testing, she smiled reassuringly. Doctors always order more tests. I'm sure it's precautionary. I think so too. She squeezed my hand. Just don't let yourself start believing you're sick before anyone knows for sure. She meant to comfort me. Instead, those words quietly stayed with me. I had no idea they would become the foundation of everything that followed. The cardiologist called 2 days later. Mrs. Carter, I'd like to see you again this week. His tone was calm but deliberate. Is something wrong? I asked. I'd rather explain everything in person. I drove to his office alone. David had planned to come, but an unexpected meeting with a client kept him away. At least that's what he told me. Dr. Benjamin Lewis greeted me with a reassuring smile before pulling my scans onto the monitor. I don't want you to panic, he began. We're seeing early signs of coronary artery disease. I stared at the screen without really understanding it. How serious is it? Right now it's treatable, but I don't want you ignoring your symptoms anymore. He pointed to one of the images. Your arteries are narrowing. Stress isn't causing the disease, but stress can absolutely trigger dangerous episodes. He handed me a printed sheet. If you experience severe chest pain, shortness of breath, dizziness, or pain radiating into your left arm, don't try to drive yourself. He paused. Call 911 immediately. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my purse. I understand. No, he said gently. I need you to promise me. I promise. Walking back to my car, I felt strangely calm. The diagnosis frightened me, but uncertainty had frightened me even more. At least now I knew my body hadn't been inventing the warnings. Something truly needed attention. David was working late when I got home. I waited until after dinner to tell him. The cardiologist found early coronary artery disease. He stopped chewing. For real. I nodded. He wants more testing medication and cardiac rehabilitation. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry. Those 2 words meant everything. For the first time in months, I felt understood. I should have gone sooner, I admitted. We'll deal with it. He sounded sincere. Looking back, I believe he meant every word. That was before fear began making decisions for him. The construction market continued getting worse. Several large projects were postponed. One developer declared bankruptcy before paying his company. David never complained. He simply worked longer hours. Sometimes I'd wake at 2 a.m. and find his side of the bed empty. I'd discover him sitting alone in the living room with financial statements spread across the coffee table. You should sleep, I'd whisper. In a minute. He'd quickly close the folders. I assumed he didn't want me worrying. I didn't realize he was already carrying worries too heavy to share. A week later, another envelope arrived from our financial advisor. David picked it up before I reached the mailbox. I'll look through it, he said. It's probably investment paperwork. Normally, we reviewed every financial document together. This time, he carried it directly into his office. I noticed. I simply chose not to argue. Marriage sometimes teaches you which conversations can wait. Unfortunately, some conversations shouldn't. 3 days later, Janet invited us to dinner. She had made roast chicken mashed potatoes and the peach cobbler David loved as a boy. The evening felt surprisingly normal. Halfway through dessert, she looked at me. So, how are you feeling? Better. The medication seems to be helping. She smiled. Good. Then she added almost absent-mindedly, just don't let this become your whole identity. I frowned. I don't understand. I watched your father-in-law become convinced every ache meant the end. David quietly shifted in his chair. Janet continued. The mind is powerful. I know. I just don't want you living like a patient. There was kindness in her voice. Real kindness. She wasn't trying to dismiss me. She was speaking from grief she had never fully healed from. That realization softened my frustration. I appreciate that, I said, but Dr. Lewis wants me to take this seriously. She nodded. I hope you do. Then she smiled. I just hope you don't stop living. It wasn't the conversation itself that bothered me. It was what happened afterward. Driving home, David suddenly said, "Mom's right about one thing." I looked at him. "You've been thinking about your health constantly." "I have heart disease." "I know. But every conversation seems to come back to doctors." I stared out the passenger window. I almost collapsed twice. "I know." He sighed. "I just miss talking about other things." That sentence hurt. Not because it was cruel, because I understood it. Illness has a way of moving into every room of a marriage until it becomes the only guest anyone notices. I promised myself I'd try harder not to let that happen. For a little while, things improved. Then Rachel Morgan called. The attorney's voice was unusually serious. "I've reviewed the first financial records, and there are transfers I can't explain." "What kind?" "Large ones." She paused. "I'd like you to come in." The next morning, she spread dozens of bank statements across her conference table. Colored tabs marked different transactions. "This account belongs to you and David." I nodded. "So does this one." Another nod. She slid forward a third document. "I can't find any record of you approving these withdrawals." I studied the page. Nearly $280,000 had been transferred over 18 months. My stomach tightened. "I've never seen this." "I didn't think you had." She opened another folder. "There's also paperwork bearing your signature." I looked down. At first glance, it resembled my handwriting. Then I noticed the tiny differences. The angle of the letters, the way the C in Carter curved, the pressure of the pen strokes. Someone had practiced it. Someone had gotten very close, but not close enough. "I didn't sign these." Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid a business card toward me. "A forensic document examiner." "You think these were forged?" "I think we let an expert tell us." Driving home, I repeated one sentence over and over. "Please let there be another explanation." Because if there wasn't, the greatest threat to my marriage wouldn't be my heart. It would be the man I had trusted with mine for 30 years. I sat in my car outside Rachel Morgan's office for nearly 10 minutes before turning the key. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my hands. I wasn't afraid of losing money. Money could be earned again. What frightened me was the possibility that Rachel was right. If David had forged my signature, it meant he hadn't made one terrible decision in a moment of panic. It meant he had made the same decision repeatedly, each time believing he would never have to tell me. I wasn't ready to accept that. Rachel looked up as I walked back into her office. "I thought you might have more questions." "I do." She motioned toward the conference table. "Sit." For the next hour, she walked me through every document. The transfers hadn't happened all at once. They had started small, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. Then the amounts grew larger. Every transfer had one thing in common. They all ended in the same limited liability company, Blue Ridge Property Development. "I've never heard of this company," I said. I checked. Rachel turned another page. "It was formed 18 months ago." "Who's listed as the owner?" "David Carter." The room suddenly felt smaller. "He started another business." "It appears so." "Without telling me," Rachel nodded once. "I believe he intended to keep it separate from your marital finances. By using my retirement savings, I can't speak to his intentions." She folded her hands. "But that's where the money came from." I looked back down at the paperwork. Nearly $300,000. 3 decades of careful saving. The retirement we had planned together. Every vacation we postponed. Every unnecessary purchase we skipped. Every extra dollar I contributed to my pension. It was all there, scattered across bank statements and transfer confirmations. Rachel quietly broke the silence. "There's something else." I looked up. "The company hasn't made any profit." "What?" "It appears to be losing money." That surprised me more than anything. David wasn't reckless. He planned everything. He researched everything. How could someone so careful make a mistake this large? On the drive home, I found myself remembering a conversation from nearly a year earlier. David had stood in our backyard watching a new subdivision being built across the highway. If I were 20 years younger, he'd said, "I'd buy land and develop neighborhoods instead of building houses for other people." At the time, I'd laughed. "Then we'd never see you." He'd smiled. "Probably not." I realized with a painful clarity that he hadn't been joking. When I reached home, his truck was already in the driveway. He was sitting alone at the kitchen table. For once, he didn't hide the paperwork spread in front of him. He looked exhausted. Older. Not physically. Emotionally. "We need to talk," I said. He nodded slowly. "I know." I placed the bank statements on the table. "Tell me everything." He stared at the documents for several long seconds. Then he exhaled. "My company started falling apart last year. I knew business was slower, You didn't know how bad. He rubbed both hands across his face. I lost 3 commercial contracts in 6 months. I remained silent. The bank wouldn't extend my line of credit. So you used our retirement. I borrowed it. You forged my signature. His eyes filled with regret. I told myself I'd put every penny back before you ever found out. Why didn't you tell me? His answer came almost immediately. Because I couldn't stand the thought of watching you lose faith in me. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Instead, I struggled to finish the sentence. You gave me a reason to. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, I'm sorry. For a brief moment, I saw the man I had married. Not a criminal, not a villain. Just a frightened husband who had convinced himself that one bad decision could be fixed by making another. Unfortunately, life rarely works that way. The front door opened. Janet stepped inside carrying a casserole dish. She immediately sensed the tension. What's going on? David stood. I told her. Janet looked from him to me. Told her what? I handed her one of the bank statements. She adjusted her glasses. Read it. Then looked back at David. You used the retirement account? He nodded. You forged Claire's signature. Another nod. Janet slowly sat down. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely shaken. I knew you were struggling. She spoke almost to herself. I didn't know you had done this. You knew? I asked quietly. She looked at me with startled eyes. I knew he needed money. She swallowed hard. He told me the bank wouldn't help. Did you know where the money came from? No. I swear to you, Claire. I thought he found private investors. David looked at his mother. I never told you. She closed her eyes. No. I never asked enough questions. The room fell silent. It would have been easy to blame Janet, to accuse her of encouraging him, but the truth was more complicated. She hadn't known about the forged signatures. She hadn't known about the retirement account. She had simply believed her son would find a way through his problems, just as I had. A week later, another call came from Dr. Lewis's office. The additional imaging had confirmed the diagnosis. Your coronary artery disease is moderate, he explained. The good news is we caught it before irreversible damage. The bad news, stress is increasing your risk significantly. He leaned forward. I strongly recommend beginning cardiac rehabilitation immediately and avoiding unnecessary emotional stress. I almost laughed. I was living in the middle of a divorce. Avoiding stress wasn't an option. Still, I followed every instruction. Medication, diet, walking program, cardiac rehab twice a week. For a while, I actually felt stronger. Then the divorce depositions began. David's attorney surprised me. Instead of focusing on finances, he focused on my health. Mrs. Carter, isn't it true you've postponed meetings because of your medical condition? Yes. Doctors still haven't cleared you. Not yet. So there remains uncertainty. Rachel objected several times. Some objections were sustained. Others weren't. Afterward, she closed her notebook. They're changing strategies. What do you mean? They know the financial records are becoming difficult to defend. So, they're attacking your credibility instead. Over the following weeks, I learned that David's attorney intended to argue something I never imagined hearing in a courtroom, that I had exaggerated my illness to delay the divorce. The accusation itself didn't frighten me. What frightened me was knowing exactly who would support it. Janet, not because she hated me, but because she still believed that people sometimes surrendered to illness before illness truly defeated them. The final hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. On Sunday evening, I stood alone in my backyard watching the sun disappear behind the trees. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about divorce. I was thinking about something Dr. Lewis had said during cardiac rehabilitation. Your heart isn't asking you to be brave. It's asking you to listen. I promised myself I finally would. I had no idea that less than 24 hours later, my heart would make sure everyone else listened too. The courthouse looked exactly the same as it had during every previous hearing. The same marble steps, the same security checkpoint, the same rows of polished wooden benches. Yet everything felt different. Rachel noticed it before we entered the courtroom. You look pale. I barely slept. Chest pain. I hesitated. A little. She stopped walking. A little. It passed. Rachel lowered her voice. Claire, if you're not well, we can ask for a continuance. I looked toward the courtroom doors. No, your health matters more than today's hearing. I've spent months waiting for someone to finally hear the truth. I managed a faint smile. I'm not walking away now. Rachel searched my face for another moment before nodding. If anything feels wrong, I'll tell you. I believed I meant it. Unfortunately, people who spend their lives putting others first often wait too long before admitting they need help themselves. Judge Eleanor Whitfield entered promptly at 9. Everyone rose. The hearing began with routine motions before David's attorney called his first witness, Janet Carter. She walked slowly to the witness stand. Unlike earlier depositions, she no longer looked completely certain. Her eyes briefly met mine. There was sadness there. Not anger. Not triumph. Just sadness. After taking the oath, she answered several questions about our marriage. She admitted David had worked tirelessly to keep his company alive. She admitted I had always managed our household carefully. Then Mr. Sullivan, David's attorney, shifted the subject. Mrs. Carter, did Claire often discuss her health with you? Janet nodded. She did. In your opinion, did those conversations increase over the past year? Yes. What did you think? Janet hesitated. For the first time since the divorce began, she didn't answer immediately. I believed. She stopped. Mr. Sullivan waited. I believed stress was making her focus on every symptom. Rachel quietly took notes. Mr. Sullivan continued. Did you believe she intentionally lied? Janet looked toward me. No. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. I never believed Claire was dishonest. Mr. Sullivan frowned slightly. But you believed. I believed she misunderstood what was happening. It wasn't exactly the answer he wanted. Rachel's cross-examination was brief. Mrs. Carter, did you know your son had forged Claire's signature? No. Did Claire ever ask you for sympathy? Janet looked directly at the judge. Never. Rachel nodded once. No further questions. As Janet stepped down, she paused beside my table. Very softly, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, she whispered. I should have listened better. Before I could answer, she continued walking. David testified next. He looked exhausted. Weeks of investigations had changed him. The confidence he once carried had disappeared. Mr. Sullivan asked about the business. David didn't hide anything. The company was failing. Why didn't you tell your wife? I was ashamed. Did you intend to steal from her? No. What did you intend? I intended to save my business. He looked toward me. And then repay every dollar. Rachel stood. Mr. Carter. Yes. Did Claire ever refuse to help you financially? No. Had you simply asked her? He lowered his head. I think she would have helped. Then why forge her signature? Silence, finally. Because asking would have meant admitting I'd failed. No one spoke. Rachel thanked him and sat down. There was no satisfaction in exposing him, only tragedy. When my turn came, I walked carefully toward the witness stand. Not because I wanted anyone's sympathy, because something felt different, not painful, heavy. Like I had climbed several flights of stairs too quickly. Rachel noticed. You all right? I think so. She helped me settle into the witness chair. The questioning began simply. We reviewed the financial records, the retirement accounts, the forged signatures. Then Rachel asked about my medical treatment. Have you followed every recommendation from your physicians? Yes. What recommendations? Medication, cardiac rehabilitation, lifestyle changes. Were you instructed to ignore your symptoms? No. What were you told? If severe chest pain or shortness of breath occurred. I paused. I was told to call 911 immediately. Rachel nodded. No further questions. Mr. Sullivan stood. He approached slowly. Mrs. Carter? Yes. You've attended cardiac rehabilitation. I have. And despite treatment, you've continued experiencing symptoms, occasionally. So today, he glanced briefly toward the judge. You're asking this court to believe your health prevented certain proceedings from moving forward. Rachel stood immediately. Objection mischaracterizes the testimony. Sustained. Mr. Sullivan adjusted his glasses. Let me ask another way. He stepped closer. Mrs. Carter, would you agree emotional stress can intensify your symptoms? Yes. And divorce is emotionally stressful? Of course. So, he stopped. Today's hearing could reasonably make you feel worse. Yes. The answer was honest. It was also incomplete. Because at that exact moment, I felt something changing. The pressure returned, much stronger. I instinctively gripped the edge of the witness stand. Rachel looked up. Claire, I tried taking another breath. It wouldn't come. The room blurred around the edges. Judge Whitfield leaned forward. Mrs. Carter, not now. Please, just let me finish. I've waited months for someone to hear me. One more minute. Just one. I opened my mouth. Nothing. Pain spread from the center of my chest into my shoulder. then down my left arm. Cold sweat covered my forehead. Rachel took a step toward me. "Claire." "I'm okay." The words barely escaped. They weren't true. I knew they weren't. Still, I wanted desperately to stay standing. Across the courtroom, I saw David rise halfway from his chair. His face had changed completely. No frustration, no impatience. Only fear. Real fear. He looked at me exactly the way he had looked 30 years earlier when I was rushed into surgery after a car accident. For the first time in months. He wasn't looking at an opponent. He was looking at his wife, Claire. His voice cracked. "Sit down." I tried. Instead, my knees gave way. The witness chair slid backward. Everything tilted. Before my head struck the floor, a man vaulted over the courtroom rail. "I'm Dr. Andrew Bennett." He dropped beside me with astonishing speed. "I'm a cardiologist." 2 fingers found my neck. His expression changed immediately. "Pulse is irregular." He checked his watch. Then my wrist again. "Blood pressure's crashing." He looked directly at the bailiff. "Call EMS." No one moved. The courtroom had frozen. Dr. Bennett's voice became louder. "Possible acute coronary syndrome." Still no movement. Judge Whitfield stood so abruptly her chair rolled backward. "Call 911. The bailiff grabbed his radio. Court officers cleared the area. Someone opened the courtroom doors. David rushed toward me. Dr. Bennett held up one hand. "Stay back." David stopped instantly. "Is she—" Dr. Bennett never looked away from me. "She's having a cardiac emergency." Silence swallowed the courtroom. The accusation that I had exaggerated my illness disappeared in a single heartbeat. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the courthouse. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the truth no longer needed anyone to believe it. When I woke again, the room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor. Soft morning light spilled through partially opened blinds, painting pale lines across the floor. My chest ached, with a deep soreness that was different from the crushing pain I remembered in the courtroom. This pain felt controlled, watched, understood. A nurse noticed my eyes open and smiled. "Good morning, Claire." My voice barely worked. "Where?" "Fairfax Memorial Cardiac Center." She checked the monitor before adjusting my blanket. "You gave everyone quite a scare." A few minutes later, Dr. Andrew Bennett walked into the room. Without the urgency of the courtroom, he looked exactly like what he was, a physician who had spent decades delivering difficult news with honesty instead of drama. He pulled up a chair. "How are you feeling?" "Tired." "I'd be disappointed if you weren't." That earned the smallest smile I'd managed in days. He opened my chart. "You suffered a mild heart attack caused by coronary artery disease." I nodded slowly. "So Dr. Lewis was right." "He was," Dr. Bennett continued. "The good news is there doesn't appear to be permanent damage to your heart muscle." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "The bad news? You ignored symptoms for too long." He didn't say it to criticize me. He said it because it was true. The disease developed over time. The stress surrounding your marriage and the court proceedings likely triggered yesterday's event, but it didn't create the illness. I stared at the ceiling. So I wasn't imagining it. "No," his answer came immediately. "You were listening to your body." He paused. "You just stopped believing it." Those words stayed with me long after he left the room. Not because they were profound, because they explained the last year of my life better than anything else ever had. Cardiac rehabilitation began before I even left the hospital. Walking 20 feet down the hallway felt strangely difficult. A physical therapist smiled patiently. "Slow is still progress." I repeated those words to myself every day. Slow is still progress. The same could have described healing after betrayal. Rachel visited 3 days later carrying another stack of documents. "This won't take long," I smiled weakly. "Nothing involving lawyers ever takes a short time." She laughed. "Fair enough." She opened a folder. "The forensic handwriting report is complete." I studied the first page. The conclusion couldn't have been clearer. The signatures authorizing the transfers were not mine. A second report summarized the financial investigation. David's development company had never become profitable. He hadn't hidden money with another woman. He hadn't built a secret life. He had desperately tried to save the business he had spent 30 years creating. One terrible decision had become another, then another, until there was no honest way back. Rachel closed the folder. "The judge reviewed these reports yesterday. What happens now?" She requested financial crime investigators review the evidence. I nodded. "And the divorce?" Rachel looked at me carefully. I think yesterday changed more than anyone expected. David came to the hospital the following afternoon. He stood awkwardly near the doorway carrying a paper bag from my favorite bakery. He looked older than he had a week earlier. Not because time had passed. Because guilt had. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. I wasn't sure either. He quietly set the bag on the bedside table. They still had cinnamon rolls. I almost laughed. You remembered. I remember everything. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked directly at me. When you grabbed the witness stand? His voice cracked. I still thought maybe you were having a panic attack. He closed his eyes. And then you collapsed. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of us could have said. I saw your face. He nodded. I've replayed that moment every hour since. He swallowed hard. I spent months convincing myself I understood what you were feeling. His shoulders sagged. The truth is, he looked down at the floor. I stopped listening long before you stopped talking. There was no defense. No excuses. Only regret. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. I only wanted you to hear me say, he struggled to continue, I'm sorry. Real apologies don't erase consequences. But they matter, because they acknowledge reality instead of hiding from it. 4 weeks later, I returned to the courthouse. Walking through those doors felt completely different. Not because the building had changed. Because I had... Judge Whitfield opened the resumed hearing with unexpected words. Before we continue, this court wishes to acknowledge Dr. Andrew Bennett for his immediate medical intervention during the previous hearing. Every head turned toward him. He simply nodded once. No speech. No recognition sought. Just quiet professionalism. The evidence unfolded over the next several hours. A forensic handwriting examiner explained exactly why the signatures were fraudulent. Bank officials traced every transfer. Financial investigators confirmed where the money had gone. Nothing suggested lavish spending. Nothing suggested another family. Only a failing business financed through increasingly desperate decisions. When David finally testified again, he stood without looking toward the gallery. I betrayed my wife's trust. His voice was steady. I told myself I was borrowing money. He shook his head. I wasn't. I was stealing her right to choose. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Whitfield waited before speaking. Mr. Carter, she folded her hands. Financial pressure explains fear. She paused. It does not excuse deception. David nodded. I understand. The judge continued. This court also finds that Mrs. Carter's medical condition was repeatedly minimized during these proceedings. She looked briefly toward Janet. No family should mistake someone's suffering for weakness simply because it cannot be seen. Janet quietly lowered her eyes. The final ruling was straightforward. The unauthorized transfers would be fully accounted for in the property division. Claire would receive reimbursement reflecting the marital assets improperly used. David would assume responsibility for the business debts he created without her consent. The matter involving the forged signatures would remain subject to the financial crimes investigation. Justice wasn't loud. It rarely is. Sometimes it simply sounds like the truth finally being spoken without interruption. 6 months later, my life looked remarkably different. I sold the old house, not because every memory there was painful, because too many of them belonged to people we no longer were. I rented a small cottage overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Every morning I walked the shoreline as part of my cardiac rehabilitation. One cool autumn morning, I passed an elderly couple sitting on a bench. The husband looked mildly annoyed. His wife rubbed her shoulder. It's probably nothing, she said. He answered without looking at her. You always worry. I slowed, then smiled. Gentlemen. He looked up. When someone you love says something feels wrong, I paused. Listen first. The woman smiled knowingly. So few people do. No, I said softly. But the ones who do can change everything. As I continued my walk, the wind carried the scent of salt water across the bay. For the first time in a very long while, I felt lighter. Not because everything had been repaired. Some things never are. I forgave David eventually. Not because he deserved it, but because I no longer wanted to carry the weight of what he had done. Forgiveness didn't reopen the door to my past. It allowed me to keep walking toward my future. If this story leaves you with one thought, let it be this. The deepest wounds aren't always the ones doctors can see. Sometimes they begin the moment the people you trust stop believing you, and sometimes healing begins the moment you decide to believe yourself again. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt unheard by someone you loved? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. We share stories about resilience, family, and second chances every day. So if this journey meant something to you, please subscribe and join us again.